Good afternoon. My name is Vaughn Clemens. I'm a retired Presbyterian pastor educator who still continues to practice educational ministry. It's my pleasure and privilege to introduce to you our speaker today. Dr. Shelly Tochluk is an educator with a background in psychology. She spent 10 years as a researcher, counselor, and teacher in California's public schools, and now trains teachers to work with Los Angeles' diverse school population as a professor in the educational department at Mount St. Mary's University in Los Angeles. She's the author of 2 books, Witnessing Whiteness, The Need to Talk About Race and How to Do It, and Living in the Tension, The Quest for a Spiritualized Racial Justice. Shelly also volunteers with AWARE LA, the Alliance of White Anti-Racists Everywhere, Los Angeles. And for the last 10 years, she has co-produced AWARE LA's 4-day summer institute entitled Unmasking Whiteness that leads white people into a deeper understanding of their personal relationship to race, white privilege, and systematic racism. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Shelly Tochluk.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for gathering here to hear me. I am clearly the white woman who's been called to recenter and make normal again the whiteness in the room, having you all looking at me. I just want to say that what I understand from having been in the room this morning is that there is a wealth of wisdom in the room. And so what I'm going to try to do as I speak this afternoon with you is to speak in a way that hopefully addresses the needs of the people in the room who are new to the subject, who have not necessarily spent years investigating whiteness and racism and race and other issues of oppression, while at the same time hopefully also speaking in a way that will invite those of you who are deep practitioners in this work to consider how maybe something I said helps to inform the practice you're already engaged with. The other thing that I want to say is that I am nervous to talk to a room full of scholars. Those of you who are practitioner-based, raise your hand and give me a big shout out. Awesome. Because I feel that I'm like a practitioner scholar. I guess I am. I do hold the title of professor, and yet at the same time I feel like I'm a piss-poor scholar and even a worse activist. So when people tell me I'm an activist, I say, really? Your standards are very low. And when they tell me I'm a good academic, I say, wow, even lower. But I like to marry. I like to marry the passions. And so hopefully some of that may show up and come out as I talk to you today. But in talking to you, I need to tell you who I am in a little bit more detail. I need to tell you that this is where I come from. This is my mom and dad. I grew up in Orange County, California, traditionally a fairly Republican, conservative kind of environment. My father was a police officer. My mother was a nurse. And both of them very egalitarian-minded. You're supposed to treat everybody equally. My mother was my Girl Scout leader and were always extremely generous in the way that they approached the world. And they never talked about race. It was just not talked about. My teachers never talked about race, except for one time. And I'll always remember it in the 6th grade. And my teacher said, I don't care if you are yellow, purple, red, green, or blue. How many of you heard something like that phrase growing up? Raise your hand, let me see. Yeah, that was very common. And so my teachers didn't talk about it. Coaches didn't talk about it. My family never talked about it. So I grew up with an absolute lack of language around race. And that's what I want to name here. There was an absolute inability for me to be articulate around the subject of race by the time I got to be toward my adolescence and my adulthood. So this created a little bit of a challenge because I also was a 400-meter sprinter. in California, and that's me in both of those pictures. That's me as the one and only white girl in the center of the track in the upper one at the California state meet for CIF finals. I got 5th place in state. And that was a real moment for me, becoming the one and only. I was the only white girl in the sea of 40 and got looked at and pointed at, and it was the first time that I went, oh wow, it feels different to be the one that is in a minority. Now, I was not treated bad, please keep this in mind, but it made me understand that it just felt different. That was the insight I had, just that it felt different. I moved on, I went to UCLA, I was part of their 4x4 meter relay team, and here's what's essential about this. It's these experiences that helped me not only feel extremely comfortable being within groups of people of color, but I also had a lot of experience listening to my teammates talk about their experiences. They didn't engage me about it, and they didn't challenge me, but they just talked amongst themselves with me bearing witness. Not actively, just passively. It wasn't always easy to hear what they had to say, but the thing is that my entire life up to then had led me to believe that I wasn't part of the problem, that because my parents had trained me to be egalitarian-minded, colorblind, not using that word, that I didn't have to take what they were saying as an indication of anything that I had anything to do with. All that broke down when I was about 25 years old, and because I felt so comfortable going anywhere, I followed a flyer in my master's program in psychology to a grade school where they had a violence intervention program. And after being a counselor there, and then after teaching there for a while, I started to get feedback. And that feedback was basically telling me that I was bringing my whiteness with me, that I was acting in ways that brought assumptions to the table, brought expectations, brought language, brought attitudes and values that were not helpful and that were actually doing damage to the children. This was very hard for me to hear. It definitely was a cracking open for me. I would love to say that I heard one message and immediately opened up and embraced the message. That is not what happened. And these were some of the messages that were delivered. You've got no idea what's going on around you. I was concerned when parents didn't show up for teacher conferences. I had been trained my whole life to assume that that meant the parents didn't care very much. It was because of me, what I represented. I didn't fully understand that at the time, but that's what I was told. And I was also told that my entire attitude about how I showed up in that space was carrying certain sensibilities that were causing me to make decisions in regards to the kids and the parents that were actually going to get the kids in trouble with authority figures in their lives in ways that was actually dangerous. Did not fully understand it again. However, it was my waking up moment. It took me years to fully grasp a lot of that. And what it has led is for me to understand so deeply that pretty much anywhere I go, and now I'm going to start making that doubled conversation. What I'm going to invite you to do now is to think about who you are as I tell you who I am, because as a practitioner who is also a teacher and stands in front of and helps to facilitate conversations with students all the time in ways that I hope create brave spaces for them to fully engage with all of who they are. This is the process I do with my students the very first day before we would engage in anything further, if that topic of that class is going to in any way deal with power, injustice, race, class, anything. And so I want to name, here are some of those big isms that many of us all know about. These are categories, ways that we are classified by the world. Doesn't matter whether we appreciate these classifications or not, but they are categories that have meaning. Society ascribes us to different positions within these categories. Does this make sense? So, which position do you occupy within each of the categories? I'm going to show you mine. This is who I am. I am a white, European American woman. I have put race and ethnicity on the same line for expediency, not because they are exactly the same thing, but for today, just go with it, please. I am also middle class. I am a woman. I am cisgender, which means, I'm going to decide that you know what that means. I'll take a question. Anybody want me to define that? Okay, cool. I am a straight woman. I am a U.S. citizen. I am currently able-bodied, and I am spiritual, not religious, and I am middle-aged. And I am inviting you to take a moment and just jot down for yourself, who are you? Who are you in regards to all of these different classifications? What's the label that society attributes to you in all of these areas? If you don't want to write them down, that's fine. Just give it a moment to think. And now I want you to think about all those different areas and all those different ways that you have been classified by the world. What's that meant for your life? What are 3 of them that you think have made potentially the biggest difference in your life? If you wrote them down, circle those 3. If you didn't write it down, write down the 3, please, that you think have made a big difference in your life. And think about why. What's maybe one particular story that comes up that bubbles to the surface in terms of why that one, why that one, why that one, for the 3 that you might select as the biggest indicators of meaning, how you've been experienced, how you've experienced the world. And I'm going to ask you to take 3 minutes. Minute and a half per person, turn to someone near you, and to the degree that you feel comfortable, share very briefly one of your stories. What'd you pick and why? And I'll try very hard to get your attention back in about 3 minutes. I failed to mention I was also a 5th grade teacher. Okay, so, and I teach a lot of people who are going to be 5th grade teachers. So the thing is, I would normally want to give you more time if we were in class. It is always hard to get that conversation to stop. How many of you wished you could have had longer? Okay. The thing is, what we would do next is to try to put context to our stories. So one way to put context to our stories is to acknowledge that in these different positions, there have been long-standing, historic, systemic patterns of oppression attached that have had very grave impacts to some communities, offering advantages to others. And the language that I introduce at this point is about target groups and non-target groups. How many of you are familiar with that language? Okay, and I'm borrowing a little bit of this from Visions Incorporated, if any of you are familiar with their training protocols. So to help my students who are sometimes brand new to this conversation, now they've lived their lives, they might have lived the context, but they might not have had the language for all of this. The target groups are those that have been systemically made less likely to succeed because of the laws and the policies that have been part of our ongoing history. And non-targeted groups have had the exact opposite effects, have been able to be statistically more likely to succeed, have been valued, seen as normal, here's that normalizing, right? Have been considered deserving and entitled of all of the rights and the privileges that they have had, while others have been seen as less than. And so at that point, what I need to do is help the students name, so who are the folks who have been targeted and who are the folks who have been not targeted on these various position points. And so understand we're starting with how are they already complex beings. So the question is, in what ways have you experienced life as having a target identity? Which ones of your identities have been targets? And as well, Which ones of your identities have not been targets? What's your complex matrix? And once they've gone and kind of circled, I then ask them this next question, which is, of the 3 identities that you selected as being most meaningful to you, how many of them were target identities? I ask you to think about that for a second for yourselves. Which of them are your non-target identities? And perhaps most importantly, what difference does it make? Now, we have an extended conversation about this, and for the sake of time, I'm not going to engage you in that conversation. I could, but we would normally spend at least a half hour on this process. But some of the points that I try to draw out most in regards to this is that for those of us who have selected and identified all 3 of the most important things as all of our target identities, there are areas where we might be not targets that have given us advantages that we're not paying attention to. Most folks, I find, pick a mix. They pick a mix of different things. The idea is also that for every area that we didn't pick as being the meaningful ones to ourselves, what it says is that it hasn't been made salient in our lives. I've been paying attention to race as a white woman for a pretty good amount of time, so I'm always, checking off race as being super significant. That doesn't mean that that makes me any better than any other white person, but it means that I'm paying attention more. I might pick up on things a little bit more than some other white folks who aren't paying attention. But for every other area of advantage that I'm not picking up on and naming is important, for whatever reason, it hasn't been made as salient, and I'm likely to miss things. So my intent when I'm working with my students is to start us all at a space of we're all really complicated. I'm just going to go here. We're all really complicated beings. We're all very unique in our particular experiences. I want to say a word about intersectionality because I heard it mentioned earlier today. How many of you are very familiar with that word intersectionality? And how many of you would be extremely upset if I let it stand here as only naming the different multiple social positions we occupy? Okay, I hear some laughter, but only 2 hands went up. So I really need to name that intersectionality is a power analysis. It's essential that it not get turned into just a general statement about diversity. So we talk about that too. We talk about the power. We talk about what it means to have double and triple and quadruple oppressions, which means that the legal system is against you in multiple ways. So it's not just about our awareness, right? It's about a very real lived reality. However, what this conversation also allows me to do as an instructor working with about 85% students of color who are coming from varied backgrounds is to acknowledge that their whole being is going to be welcome in the room and that everybody is in a complicated, nuanced place, and that when we talk about power and privilege, we're not talking about individual people as being bad people. What we're talking about are systems of power that are problematic, and all of us are working at navigating those systems. And it's all of our responsibilities to become more aware of the areas where we're advantaged so that we can help to disrupt the systems that continue to disadvantage people in the variety. Does that make sense? So, that being said, this is where I started. It took me a long time to get to the place of understanding, oh wow, I've got a lot to learn. And it took me a long time to get to know what my privileges were, and again, I'm going to focus now again on race for a little while. And I'm going to talk about my own racial advantages as a white person. I say AKA privileges, quite frankly, because I don't always lead with that term. I find it sometimes less expedient, depending on who I'm talking to. I understand that for some people it feels like it's a buzzword or it evokes different emotions. And quite frankly, I find that I can have a really solid conversation about privilege without saying the word. Sometimes, for a while. So, I just want to run through some things. I'm going to run through these fairly quickly, but for the sake of those of you in the room who are like, yeah, this is newer in some ways, I split these into 3 different zones. My growing up experience, my coming into an adult establishment experience, and then what's ongoing, just to throw up a few things. So, me growing up. I didn't have to think about race or racism, how it can impact me. I think we heard about that a little bit earlier. Certainly didn't need to worry about being a bad representative of my race. I always assumed it was okay for me to go and be anywhere. There was no conference or event that seemed like I wasn't supposed to be there. And if they did seem like it wasn't supposed to be there, well, then weren't they the problem? That's how I was taught to see the world. I was given the benefit of the doubt and assumed to be trustworthy and smart in so many instances when I probably didn't deserve it. And schools regularly showed that people of my race were the doers and the creators and the achievers. As was mentioned earlier today, church showed me imagery of God and Jesus as white men. I grew up going to a Lutheran church. And the posters in class, they showed white men to be the epitome of evolution. Now, this one hurts. I'm going to show you the poster that I found that dug into my brain. It was never talked about. The poster was never actually talked about. Seriously, and there's an hour-long presentation I could do to let you know how it's about life or death, and there are black people who are getting killed behind it. That's for a different day. So, as I was establishing myself, I could choose to be in the majority if I wanted without any negative result to my livelihood at all, where I chose to go to school, where I chose to get a job, where I chose to live. People in positions of power saw themselves reflected in me and told me so. I understood the systems that I needed to engage with for my future because the people around me in positions of power helped to ensure that I was fluent in them. I never had to modify my appearance, my hair, or my dress to fit cultural norms that felt foreign to me in order to get a job. And I felt comfortable with these social cues and behavior patterns that allowed me to fit in. Now, this is a limited list, just for the sake of showing you a little bit. There are many, many more. But as an adult, the personal care products that work with my skin and hair, they're easy to find anytime, anywhere, no problem. Even here, where I forgot stuff. No need to have the talk with my children, where I too have had them. I can call the police without fear for my safety. I can engage in dialogues about race by choice. We heard that earlier. Here's one thing that's different, though. I can receive praise for talking about race. And I receive praise for it all the time. And when I'm talking about race, I'm listened to with less skepticism. And let's be clear, that's why I'm here right now. And there's nothing wrong inherently with white people talking to white people about race. There is something useful in that. It can be a strategic move. It's challenging when we don't know that that's what's going on and we can't name it. But at least name it so we understand that that is what's happening. And that that's a moment of trying to use privilege to disrupt privilege. But it's inherently problematic. And it just is. It just is. So I say all of that to you to say that this is where I've gotten to, is understanding all of these things. It was not clean and easy because I was a mess of white fragility, a real mess of it. And I spent a lot of time digging into why that was so and what was going on for me. You heard the definition of it earlier today if you were in the room. So I'm not going to repeat all of it. I'm simply going to say that I think it's a real thing that I have spent a lot of time trying to figure out how do I navigate isn't quite the right word. Address, move over, move under, work around, move through, make fall apart. Because I think it's essential that any one of us doing work with any group of folks, particularly if those folks include white folks either who are our students or our fellow faculty members, our fellow organizational members, or the administrators where we teach, are able to have the conversations that we need them to have. All right, so I'm trying to get really strategic because here's what I think happens a lot. These are not just my personal responses in terms of white fragility, but these are the things that I hear so often in an organizational context. Oh, that is so horrible. I am so glad that nothing like that happens here. Or, thankfully, we have educated ourselves enough to know that this would never happen in our community. Now, often these things are about microaggressions. They're also about equity issues. Or then there's the excuse making, that this is really out of ignorance and most people don't intend to be hurtful. It may be true, but, there are really more pressing matters right now. Why are we focusing on something we've already resolved? That happens too much for my comfort, that's for sure. So, what I would like to do now is share with you about 4 different things that for me have become really important in how I move forward to try to address whiteness in the areas where I have my spheres of influence. And hopefully, to some degree, some of it can be useful to you. So first, what I want to do is some paying attention and teasing apart of some definitions, because I think they get collapsed a lot, and I think they get collapsed within anti-racism movements in a way that's not helpful. And so what I want to name first is that when we talk about whiteness, we're not just talking about white people. Okay? White people are people who are being considered white by social norms based on a whole history that was actually laid out fairly well this morning in terms of the history of how whiteness came to be. It's definitely about power and economics and all of that and more. But here's why this is important. Because whiteness, which is that entire nest of the cultural norms and expectations and laws and all of it, all of what you see there, all of that, white people get to have different relationships to it. White individual people have to be able to navigate and reject and rework and challenge whiteness in a way that still allows them to stand up as decent people. I believe that. And I believe that's important because I do stand here as someone who believes that white identity process is an important thing, and I will tell you why in a moment. White identity is how a white person perceives or experiences themselves in terms of race. And so here are the arguments that I want to offer in regards to this. Because I think that white people do need to develop a healthy white anti-racist identity. And here's why, and for those of you who are whiteness scholars, you'll follow me, I hope. There are really in the literature 2 primary kind of zones, that buckets, if you will, of where people end up falling in this topic. And if you are a person who's picking up anti-racism for fairly new, you're going to find articles and books that are often operating out of one or the other and can get confused if it's not clear how they're related to each other or not. And so here's what I would suggest. One big, huge bucket is the neo-abolitionists, the race traders, who are saying we have to actually completely do away with it. We have to deconstruct it. We have to not identify as white. It's the only way forward. There's absolutely zero redeeming about whiteness whatsoever because it has no value. And the bottom line is that the goal is to completely eradicate the whole concept whatsoever, because that's the only way liberation and justice is going to be achieved. I believe in the goal. 100% believe in the goal. There's a whole other bucket that a lot of educators end up falling into. And the educators that fall into it would argue something like, yeah, the idea is that whiteness has absolutely zero fundamental value and it needs to be fully deconstructed. And in order for us to do that, we have to own our relationship to it. And in order to own that relationship to whiteness, we have to develop something of an anti-racist white identity so that we actually come together as white people to dig into the nuances of how it gets into our psyche and our soul. Because if we don't spend enough time doing that, then we're just going to keep replicating stuff, thinking that we're beyond it when we're really not. The goal's the same. the pathway is theoretically different. I think different groups might have very good arguments for going in one direction or another. I heard Liz earlier name in her 90-second, where are you, Liz? I heard the naming of why you would go in the direction around having the Jewish cultural identity as something that can support the deconstruction of whiteness, and I think that is beautiful. That makes sense. And as a non-Jewish person who has my European roots so far mixed up, there's nothing for me to go back to that has any authenticity to it. So I'm in a different kind of position in terms of how I can relate to that subject. And so that's where that nuance comes in. And I'm naming all of this for you simply for the fact that if we're engaging in an anti-racist stance, there is a way that our academics can lead us into positions that can end up inadvertently putting us in opposition to others, or we end up arguing with others, and then we've centered ourselves all over again. And that's really not what we want to do. What we want to do is stay attentive to the final goal, and the goal is to undermine the valuing of whiteness as a thing. And that we all want to do, whether we identify as white people or not. Right? Okay. The other thing I want to do, which is not up here, but I think it's necessary for what's happening in the populace today, spend any time with anti-racist folks, especially the activists on the ground or the hardcore folks who are doing education around it, and you're going to come to an article called White Supremacy Culture. Raise your hand if you know of it. Oh, new, okay, a few folks. Okay, White Supremacy Culture. This document, which I absolutely think you should look up, because if you're talking about decentering the normativity of whiteness, this is the one. This is the one you want to read because it's written for organizations and it names about 15 different, what am I trying to say, elements, the word escapes me, the points of tendencies, I'll call it that for a second, that are very typical in whiteness and white supremacy culture, a culture that's uplifting white norms. And it's written in a way that offers, this is what it looks like in an organization when it's uplifting white norms, and here are the antidotes. This is what you can do to try to get out from under it. And it's fantastic. It's absolutely fantastic. The challenge that's been happening in anti-racist spaces for the last couple of years is that it's become so popular that now we're training most people that enter anti-racism to say, I'm a racist and here's white supremacy culture all around me. I know that's accurate and I can go with it because I understand the analysis underlying it. Most of the population that's not really hooked in, all they hear is, you just told me I was like the Charleston tiki torture people. And what we've done is we've made the connection between what still has been ingrained because of our social milieu as racially problematic and biased and still living out the systems as being a direct tie without creating any distinction between that unconscious and the conscious. And what we've got then is a population who's super freaked out by thinking that they're getting attached to this other group. And so I think it is useful as a strategy to talk about the difference between a culture that advantages white norms and makes a distinction between that than a white supremacist, an ist who believes in what they're doing as a conscious intent, if that makes any sense. Okay. Tema Okun, if you just look up white supremacy culture, Tema, T-E-M-A-O-K-U-N, you will find it's easy, download, go. All right, that being said, here's why I believe that the healthy anti-racist identity part is worth striving for. I think it's worth striving for because far too often when someone gets turned on, learns about this stuff for the first time, by and large, there are two buckets, again, of reaction that are going to show up at some point, likely. Not all the time. It's fantastic when people are able to move to action steps without falling into these areas. But the shame and the guilt are really undermining lots and lots of efforts out there to do really good work. And what I hear a lot are people saying shame and guilt, shame and guilt, shame and guilt. But no one's talking about how they're not the same thing. So they're not the same thing. I thought they were the same thing until 3 years later when I found out, oh, they're not the same thing. And I've been like really acting out of shame, but I thought it was guilt because that was easier to handle. Not. So the shame thing is actually not a redeemable thing. We really want, and I'm saying we now for the white folks who are going to be working with white folks. Okay, I'm being really specific in my use of we on this. We want to be really careful that when we, as white folks, are trying to pull white folks into the conversation, that we are not doing so in a way that is going to create and evoke a shame response, because it doesn't help anything. All it does is turn people inside out thinking how bad they are as people, right? As opposed to centering on what's the actions, what's the responsibilities, right? So the guilt part of it is actually more located around what is my responsibility, how am I complicit, how have I done things that actually are worth me feeling guilty over that I've actually been part of. I'm not a real big fan of guilt. I think both of these things can turn people into folks who experience a lot of paralysis. How many of you know about the needy white person cliche? Folks of color, how many of you have needy white people around you? I was that person for a good amount of time. And that looks like, okay, tell me I'm doing okay. I just want to make sure y'all are right, you know? Am I all right? Did I do that right? Yeah. We need to be able to stand strong enough in an anti-racism stance. We have to earn it. Don't get just to decide it. We have to earn it. We have to get good enough at what we do that we get to earn it. But then we can hold whatever, and the folks in Aware and I, we have this little metaphor. We talk about how big's your ball of guilt. Okay, white people, how big's your ball of guilt? Are you carrying it around like you're hunched over, like you can't even move? Because guess what? You are no good to the anti-racism movement with that big of a ball of guilt. Mine's about yay big, fits in my backpack, take it everywhere I go. But I got it. I still got it because I know I'm missing opportunities to do something better every day. But I also know I'm working every day. So I can manage it, so I can keep moving on. I can use it as a motivator. Okay? I think a healthy white anti-racist identity allows for that process. It allows me to put myself in position around all the systems, understand where I sit, and still keep moving forward. And I personally have found that valuable. The people around me, where I work, have found that valuable. So I'm going to offer number two point of value. And this was named before, interestingly enough. I don't think she knew I was going to do it. This is Beverly Daniel Tatum. Anybody know Beverly Daniel Tatum? Woohoo, yeah. Love her. She's the one who rocked my world with that book right up there about 20 years ago. 20th year anniversary edition just came out this year. You might want to look it up. It's fantastic. But she basically, in that book 20 years ago, made that same statement about, you know, we're like fish in a fishbowl and we don't even recognize the water we're swimming in. Here's why I love that when I'm working with other white people, because it lets me say, you are not to blame for this. It wasn't your fault. It's all in the water. Don't you see? Nobody's trying to make you feel guilty. No one's trying to make you feel shameful. This isn't about that. It's not about that. It's about getting clarity about the water. That's all it is, so we can do a better job trying to clean up the water. That's what it's about. And here's why. It's because, there we go. Because I get to blame society. Because I was truly upset when my world cracked open and I started to understand that the perennial lies that I was fed. Because my teachers didn't know any better. Because guess what? The same teachers that spoke to me in a colorblind way, that fed me the same stories about how our nation came to be, they were taught the same way. We got textbook publishers publishing to make money so that they are publishing textbooks that are getting sold in the largest markets in the country. The largest markets are California and Texas. It means about half the population is reading textbooks designed for Texas. And their idea about what slavery and genocide of Native American peoples should look like in a textbook for young children. And all you have to do is listen to what folks say about how we really want children to stay innocent and grow up to have a good idea about how we're all together as one America, to understand what they are and are not going to show in those textbooks. So our entire history is presented to a lot, if not most, of our population in a way that is not terribly helpful to deconstruct any of this, which means it further generations are receiving the same messages. So I didn't learn any of the stuff I'm talking about in a program. None of this happened in school. And now that I'm teaching educators, I'm trying to teach them to disrupt the textbooks that they're about to receive. But these teachers don't know how to talk about it either. They have just as little racial literacy as I did when I was 25 years old teaching. So we got a lot of work to do. That's my point. We got a lot of work to do. But it's not their fault that they've been raised this way. Now that's a strategy. People in the room know we can argue that by about consciousness, I should have been seeing it. I get it. It's true. It's absolutely true. It's a strategy to let folks bypass the guilt and shame to get them motivated to do work. And I can get people a lot farther, a lot faster by trying to bypass and skip over, draw a bridge around that guilt and shame thing. Because guess what? The guilt's going to come anyway, at least a little bit of it. No stopping it. But at least a manageable amount can help keep people moving forward. Okay. Next one. Okay. So the both and mindset. Super popular these days. How many of you talk about having a both and attitude? Yeah. How many of you actually have one? I mean, like real, like for real, like as a practice, like an actual practice where you have like actually eliminated the word but from your conversations on race. Like where you actually dig in to find where is the part of connection that I can find the truth in what this other person is saying so that I can rephrase, reframe, grab onto that nugget and say yes. Say yes and validate something of their existence in life to then say and then complicate it with something that has an anti-racist aspect to it. So for me, this has been huge and a lot of work is trying to create this both and mindset. But it is about trying to hold two contradictory ideas in mind at the same time. It is the title of the second book that I've written called Living in the Tension. That book is really a 20-year product of what happened for me trying to live really closely in my spiritual community, which is exceedingly multiracial, multi-generational, all over the place, trying to move away from oppressions, but without ever talking about it. I'm in LA, right? We're all talking about how transcendent and everybody's walking 2 feet off the ground and, I am not lying. I mean, so much of the dialogue is about how, we're all just so human and aren't we so glad that we're over all this stuff? And that's the spiritual conversation that's present where I live. So when I hang out with my activist folk, they're not trying to hear any of that. No, and understandably not, right? So the both and, for me, is a way that I am working real hard at trying to figure out what can I say and do to try to name the tensions that show up, because the truth of the matter is that we are all more than just our physicality, and we are also the racialized beings that we are, right? And there's a lot of different tensions that show up that I'm trying to live out. So anyway, that's where this kind of came from for me, but I will tell you that what I love about having an actual practice around this is that it is the base. It's the base for having those nuanced, complicated conversations, because life is nuanced and complicated. In case you aren't figuring this out, I don't do well in sound bites. Get tore up by Fox News if I try to have a conversation with them. But I talk in essays. I don't have race conversations on social media. It's just not my thing. There are people who do it really well, though. But the thing is, here's what the both and lets me do with my new white folk to the conversation. It lets me say this. Because Robin DiAngelo is a friend of mine, and I love what she does with white fragility, because it's all accurate. So now that I've learned what's accurate about what she's saying, my job, I figure, is to figure out what I do about it. What's my best method of navigating it to get out under it, right? Because I know for me and all my spiritual folks, they are not going to join up to a conversation that says, you're not good. They're just not. Now, I get that we have to get over the worry about, are you saying I'm not a good person? Both and. Yeah, you are a good person. And you're complicit with racism. It's both. It's not either or. Why can't it be both? Why can't we be good, decent people and be complicit with racism? Because the thing is, we got to have hope. I'm not really into the ist thing. I didn't show up saying I'm a racist. I don't find it useful. I find it triggering for the folks that I'm trying to convince. But I definitely talk about there being racism inside me. It's a small point, but it's one that I have found useful. Just like we are all human. Absolutely. That is the most important race there is the human race. And we are all racialized beings, and we are not doing it because we want to be. But that is what we are dealing with in terms of society, and it does make a difference, and both are true. And so if we get to that point, then we can have this conversation where there's a lot of folks who are really invested in healing processes, but really invested from the point of focusing on our similarities is what's going to get us to the healing place. How many of you have folks in that place around you? Raise your hand, let me hear it. Ooh, nobody? Nobody's really in that place? Okay, I thought so. Yeah. The thing is, there can be some beautiful kumbaya moments like that. But what doesn't get talked about is that on the way out the door, people are like, stepping on each other's toes and re-injuring, right? So we have to acknowledge the different histories as part of the necessity. Now, this is just a sampling. This is just to make real my point about the both and how I personally use it in conversation so that I can try to pull in my folks one to the other. Because quite frankly, some of my activist folks are really not trying to hear that having any sort of deeper love, graceful relationship with one another is useful either. And that's, I'm not sure, super helpful either. So to me, it's recognizing that the poles have validity on their own, and it's much stronger together. And I was having a conversation yesterday about this too. For those of you who are like, how come these things are all separated? Because it seems like it all goes together to me. Like I grew up with it all being together. How come you separated it? Because for white folks, it's separated. For most white folks, it's separated. And so this is a big task to try to pull it together so that we can have an understanding of the integration of this. Because our lives were able to move on with only one pole. See, our lives didn't depend on the second pole being integrated. Does that make sense? So, this is the last one. I really want to know, honestly, how many of you or people you know have this one as a tagline on your email? Be honest. Be honest. Raise your hands. I've never had a room where someone hasn't raised their hand to that. Thank you very much. Right. Super common. Be the change. It's awesome. Be the change. Absolutely be the change. And then get out to the streets. Right? Okay. The balance. Okay, so I have to give you a moment to look at this because this has been really influential for me. This is number 3. This is about the systemic perspective. I will try to be as brief as I can about this, but here's what you need to know. If you look at these 3 columns on this side, it all is under the individualistic lens, and this was named earlier today, that white culture definitely is all about the individual, that rugged individualism. Well, it breeds 3 different orientations in terms of how we are looking at difference. And by we, I am talking about those people who are in a non-target position. This doesn't just have to be about race. This could be about any of those target, non-targets that you were looking at, right? So I started out in this far over corner with just being rather indifferent because I didn't realize there was something I was supposed to pay attention to, at least in terms of race, right? Thankfully, I think I bypassed the pushing away part, the distancing, just because that's just not how my life played out. But I spent a lot of time in this inclusion one, and I want you to think about this inclusion one for a while because I want you to think about your institutions and how the words inclusion and diversity work at your institutions. Because if inclusion and diversity mean, y'all are welcome, we so much want to diversify, we want everybody to be here, but we want people to be here in a way that works for us in our structures and systems, then that may be inclusion, but it's not equity. And that's where when I talked to other campus folks, and boy, I had a 2-year fight to make sure that our VP was not the VP of diversity and inclusion. It had to be the VP of diversity, inclusion, and equity. Because without the E, you know they're not as far along as they want to be or should be. Right? Okay, so this inclusion one is, well, the point of it is who gets blamed. That's really the point here. Who's getting blamed for things being as they are? Because in these individualistic ones, the orientation is around, well, people basically end up where they are because of their life choices. That's the orientation. Now, here's what's important about this shift, and this is where this little arrow is over to the other side with the other two, where it talks about having a systemic lens. Here's the important part about that. Notice this one of awareness. Awareness is where you start to see the systems clearly. How many of you know that there are so many white people in the last 2 to 3, 4, Black Lives Matter? How many have woken up and are like, holy cannoli, didn't know that was happening. Okay, now I'm on it. I'm on the job. Raise your hand. How many of you know white people like that? Okay. A lot of white people opening up. Are they solid enough to withstand that everything else in their life is pushing them back? Because most white people who grow up with the individualistic lens, when they open up to the systemic reality, all their friends and all their family and all the news media continues to offer the individualistic lens. So unless you're actually steeped in a community that is ready to continue to feed you the good feelings of stick with the systemic thing, it's worth it. It's worth it. This one is identified as being the most emotionally challenging place to be. And why I'm really hot on this is because I don't want to lose people here. Because when people open up here, there's a lot to do with those folks to get them moved on over into a healthy, anti-racist, productive way of being in solidarity where they can actually say, you know what? This isn't about just them, them, them. I'm not just the ally. This is for me too. This allyship is actually solidarity, because what I'm fighting for is a world I want to be in. It's a world I want my children to be raised in. It is actual justice for everybody, because guess what? The system as it stands isn't good for anybody. And that's the trick. That's really when you get folks into undermining white normativity, is when you get white people to recognize that it's not just about a flip turn up and down, privilege, not privilege thing. It's actually about a system that is working to separate privilege and non-privilege, but everybody's messed up because of it. That make sense? Okay. Probably don't have too much time left, but I'm going to take just a little bit of time. This is the last main point that I want to make, and I'm making it because it's something that I didn't take seriously enough for way too long. Now I'm taking it very seriously, so I want to not mess up as I talk to people. It continues with the systemic nature, but what it highlights is that there are 4 different types of bias, and you can lay race on this, you can lay any other of the isms on it, depending on what aspect you want to be working on at any given time. But here's the trick. The internalized and the interpersonal are the areas that most people in campuses end up taking up first and then sticking with that and having all their arguments over that. Here's why that happened for me. Because when those eggs on that plate got cracked and I got cracked open, it was because people were telling me I was interpersonally creating a problem. They were telling me that I intrapersonally had trouble. And so that's what I focused on, because I just wanted to fix the relationships. I get it, that's why I started there, but then I stayed there a long time. Because the intrust stuff is how has society put all that junk in me, like that ridiculous evolution poster, right? But then how it shows up is how I make assumptions about the kids, or how I treat them in ways like, I'm going to give you every other chance in the planet, and I'm not going to hold you to any consequence because my white guilt is showing, and then you, as a child of color, is actually not being held to any kind of standard because I can't stand as a powerful white anti-racist in the room and understand that my love for you as a child needs to be comparable to your parents' love, which is expecting absolute excellence from you. Does that make sense? Because I can expect excellence from kids of color. I should expect excellence. All the teachers that I train need to expect excellence because excellence is there to be had. Does that make sense? Now, here's the part that we miss. All that stuff, that's what we're talking about when we focus on microaggressions. Okay? Microaggressions, the way that folks who are part of a non-target identity end up stepping on the toes of folks who are targeted. All sorts of different ways of looking at it. All you have to look up is microaggressions, and you're going to get the 2-page thing from UCLA, and look it up, and it's useful. What I miss, though, are these other two, the institutional and the structural. The institutionals, how's your system operate? In what way is equity not showing up in your system? Because that has to be paid attention to, too. And then the structural is how all the institutions are working together over time, creating cultural norms and assumptions, and whiteness is infused in all of it. Does that make sense? So when people are actively saying, no, we have to change the system, we're talking about these two layers. So if you're only talking about the other two layers and not getting to these two layers, don't be surprised when people say your practice is incomplete. Okay. Now, I'm going to close with a series of questions. I might not even read all of them because I think you got questions earlier from Mary. So I'm going to hit a couple that have been most meaningful to me. And this PowerPoint can be shared. I saw some folks taking some pictures. This can be posted so y'all can have access to this if you want to. So I'm not cheating you out of any of these questions if you like them. But I'm going to tell you that for me, what's been really hitting me hard lately has been, okay, hit one by one, intrapersonal in my own teaching, all right? I need to think about how I unconsciously am still privileging white norms in my classroom. I need to constantly be asking myself that. There's a lot of reading I can do about that, but it links to interpersonal bias in my classroom. And I've been working on this thing for my school lately that is about creating inclusive syllabi. And I've been looking up a lot of different campuses' resources. And there are a couple of questions that have been really important. Who do I actively include? And what's the tone of my syllabus? Do I have inclusivity or diversity statements? And perhaps more importantly, because a statement doesn't do everything, it's basically, how do I make sure my students know where I stand? Okay, I might put the statement on there, but like, is that just the institution statement? How do the students actually know where I stand on all this stuff? Now, in one of my classes, I teach all this, so we're really talking about it all the time. But if they haven't had me before, how am I making that known? Am I just assuming I'm going to be nice and they're going to figure it out along the way? That might be expecting them to take more risk. Why am I not the one taking the risk to name myself earlier on? Does that make sense? Now, from an institutional standpoint, I'm not sure how many of you have climate surveys or something like that, but I had one of my students come in last spring and did this activity with us because they were in charge of facilitating, and they asked this question right down here, the bottom one. How would a visitor know that we are an inclusive campus? What are the visible markers that exist? And what they had us do was pick a different domain, one of the social identifiers that we talked about earlier, and had us go on a 10-minute search of the campus and then return. Now, I, as a faculty member, I know where our statements are located on the web, and I know we've got, certain groups on campus to support this, that, or the other group, but they're hidden behind the portal. So if a prospective student was coming to our campus, how would they actually know where we stand? And I was humbled, because after 10 minutes, I'm like, oh boy, we ain't flying the flags. We are not letting folks know who's welcome here on this campus. And that gave me great pause, so I'm taking that back to our committee that's working on these issues. There's a lot of different things we need to be thinking about. Okay. Last thing on the way out. What we want to be able to do is move from a position of bystander to a position of allyship, solidarity, locate ourselves. Where are we? Wherever we're starting, it's okay. It's just the starting point, and then we need to see what kind of moves we can make. Oh, here we go. That's the one. All right. So hopefully we are not at a point of actively engaging in challenging behaviors, especially if we hope we're not doing it consciously. But guess what? We might be doing it unconsciously, and we need to be open to hear the feedback around that. Once we start to get a flavor for it, and you probably have colleagues in your own schools, you go, oh yeah, that's that person, that's that person, that's that person. There are people who just rest silent, they're watching it, but they don't know what to do yet. That's still passive. It's still a bystander. And for me, the difference between a bystander, and this is where my witnessing whiteness came in, a bystander, they just watch and leave. A witness can show up to court and say, yep, I saw that in the search for justice. So to me, that witnessing whiteness is a justice move. Right? So once we get over to this point of taking action, taking an active point of educating ourselves and then starting to stand up to educate others and then becoming true solidarity partners with other people, this is really the gold. That's what we're really hoping for and hoping to support moving people along to. Now, how do we do that? So one of the things that I am in efforts to do is to create resources for folks, especially folks who don't have all the money in the world. And so what I end up supporting people on the ground to do a lot is to create communities of practice where people get together, go deep into a book study practice, especially if they're new to this, right? I'm the white person working with white people stuff. So this is something that sometimes people do it multiracially. Both are designed to be able to be done multiracially, but for obvious reasons, often it's like, nah, y'all white people, you go do your thing. Like, check back in with us when you're done. That makes sense to me too. But people do what's right for them at their community levels. So each of these books have full resources for a full curriculum that goes along with it, and it's free, and it's on my website that should be downloaded. I brought a couple of books of each just to show. I'd be happy to have somebody buy them and take them off my hands because I get on a plane soon. But I didn't know about your functioning here, so I just got a couple of each. They're about couple $22 on discount. You get my author's discount. But the point is all the agendas, all the handouts, all the facilitation notes, everything is there available for you to go with because the money isn't important, it's the mission. Does that make sense? Okay. So this is who I am. I'm easy to get a hold of, except by phone. Leave a message if I don't get back to you via email, because I will get the phone message eventually. Email sometimes knocks folks out. So you can have both of those if you want to be in touch, and I would be happy to share with you in your process to keep things moving along. Thank you so much for your attention. I talked forever. I apologize.
We're going to give you just a moment of silence to think about what you've heard and to perhaps formulate a question. We're not going to have time for too many at this point, but give yourself just a moment to think about what you've heard and how you might frame a question for Dr. Tochluk. Okay, in order to further honor the content of what we're working on at this conference, I'm going to invite our first two questions to come from people of color or non-white folks, as I use my sense of whiteness as being the norm. But if we could hear from two people of color first, and then we'll open it to the rest of the group. Who has a question for Dr. Tochluk?
just to break the silence. Thank you very much, Shelly. So I don't know U.S. context. I'm from Canada, and ultimately, whiteness is about hegemonic power, and that is beyond personal, but structural and systematic, and so on. And I think you nailed that really well. But so I'm talking theologically here. If whiteness to be dismantled or deconstruct, I think there should be a way the power is also shared. In other words, those who are in power, recognized and earned, whatever, unearned, earned, need to learn how to give up, right? Kenosis, self-emptying practice as Christian and as other religious tradition, that sense of sharing, giving up. Is there some kind of witnessing in your part, in your work, ways that is happening or that you could suggest?
Yeah, I can talk about that. I think I can speak personally in the sense from an activist and then from a faculty position. So as an activist position, constantly checking in with the folks of Color Solidarity Partners to make sure that I'm not the one that gets picked up for the media, not trying to take up that space, but trying to uplift that voice, trying to ensure that, that I'm in the background in some of the efforts that are going on so that it doesn't become about me. And a faculty position, it is about recognizing that we need to hire more faculty of color. We just do. My context, it's a 70% white faculty with about 70% students of color ratio. That's not okay. And so for me personally, it's about helping to try to bring this conversation to our administration and our faculty and our hiring practices to try to help people understand how their unconscious biases are actually even disrupting a very liberal location that is thinking that they're making good practices, think that they want to hire other faculty members of color, and then will talk themselves out of it because of some very tried and true ways. And so I'm trying to uplift that to disrupt that pattern at the very least. Yeah. And then supporting my fellow faculty of color members. When they want me to speak, I speak. When they're the ones to speak, to make sure that there's space and to help create space so that they have a platform. Thank you.
Another question?
I actually have two. What advantage is it to whites to give up their white privilege? And number two, can we ever have a society, especially here in America, where racism is minimized or eliminated, do you think?
Yeah. I'll do it backwards. The second question, it was George Tinker, he's a native author and theologian, I believe, who talked, he works in addiction work. And he said, for addiction studies, if it takes about at least as long to get over something once you've had it, as long as you've had it. And so if we've got 400 years of intensive institutionalized racism, it's going to take us at least that long to dismantle it. So I'm in this for the long haul. It's way past my lifetime. So yeah, I think it's possible. I don't necessarily see it on the immediate horizon, not by a long stretch. I know how it's too deep, both in structure and in psyche. But I think it's possible in some far distant future. In terms of the benefits, I think that's exactly the challenge, is that we have white people believing that it's not a loss to live one's life in a segregated, racist environment, that does no damage to our own psyche. It's not accurate. And there are a lot of very personal ways that we can get into that, but then just practically, it's not conducive to a healthy community, to a healthy environment for us to be raising and training people to be at odds in the inequalities that we have. So I apologize for not having my list all set out for you, but I swear there's a list. There really is. It's not necessarily an economic list. I can go that direction. You know, I can talk about the economic benefit of society, but that ends up me being in a capitalist mode, and I don't always like to be there. I know there can be some pushback on that question, though, because when the white folks I know that are taking that question extremely personally are developing actual, like, personal stake essays around it to talk about sort of like the culture of whiteness and white normativity and how a lot of those elements and characteristics, that's the word, the characteristics of white supremacy system actually isn't a white supremacy is not actually healthy. All the perfectionism that's part of it, all the paying attention to head over the heart, all of that stuff, all that like conflict avoidance, all the aspects of, you know, it's about numbers and about quantity and not about the quality, all that stuff actually damages us too. We are actually not in good relationships with each other based on this stuff. So we actually will be healthier if we undermine that for ourselves as well.
You mentioned, oh, thanks. You mentioned that you get praised for this work, being a white person. You also mentioned intersectionality and kind of that intersectionality is about power. I'm curious to know whether you being a white woman impacts what you do in negative ways in particular, but maybe not, maybe you don't experience that.
I have not experienced it in negative ways, but thank you so much for the question because it prompts something else that I forgot to say that I wanted to. I am one of those women who can identify, if I need to, the ways that gender has impacted me negatively. And I spent most of October with my stomach completely tied up in knots and not sleeping. And I took the hearings very hard. That said, my personal life trajectory, I do not believe that I have suffered. I have been a Title IX recipient, all my sports, all my scholarships. I work in the field of education. I work in an environment, a women's college. So I don't, and I have been gratefully walking through the world in a way that I have not had any violence perpetuated against me because of my gender. That said, I could probably talk about, like, you know, some inner psychological stuff that I understand that comes from it. But in terms of that intersection, I usually am not a great addition to how that plays out. Because I'm someone who gives space to other women who have experienced more struggle around that. But the thing I forgot to say is that I think it's really important to make conscious space for the white, straight Christian men. I call them my unicorns. The anti-racist white men, we need more of them. I don't want to chase them out of the room. I don't want the white, straight, middle class who checked off non-target all the way down. I check off non-target all the way down except for gender, and I don't even feel that bad. But I want more anti-racist spaces to have more white anti-racist cis men there, naming that the culture as a whole is also not good for them. Because if they can get in touch with that toxic masculinity and how toxic racism is, then they've got access to an influence that I probably don't have, right? And so, I mean, we need all of us engaged and on board.
I want to thank you for a wonderful presentation. For me, it was in many respects eye-opening in a variety of ways. And I don't want to change the subject, but I do want to shout out for Liz a little bit this morning. And the idea that there are, I guess I'm trying to figure out how to say this. There's a way in which whiteness homogenizes, not to mix metaphors here. We're in a multi-faith religious education organization. I'm not sure if anybody here paid attention to the fact that we're having our business meeting on Friday night, which is for me the Sabbath. So next year we're not going to have the business meeting on Friday night, which is for me the Sabbath, but I wonder what's going to happen afterwards. So I applaud Liz for the courage to stand up and say that I'm looking for a way to find my own identity even with this within this other racial identity. And might I say there's a bit of, what's the word, microaggression in the denial of that of that sub-identity and suggest that perhaps even in the European-American framework, there are a bunch of other identities there that need to be surfaced rather than homogenized.
Yeah, thank you. I do want to, I want to say that I really appreciate what you're saying, and my call out to Liz, I hope that you heard it as an uplift. If it didn't come through, I want to make sure that it's an uplift, because what I heard you say was really impactful to me, because I had not ever heard that before. And I thought that was really important. For me, as someone who is one of those like German plus a little Russian plus a little Italian, I see so many white European Americans who don't have a Jewish descent that is alive and real for themselves, trying to go back and claim a European identity that's no longer a direct link as a way to excuse and bypass the look into the whiteness part. And that's the part that I tend to be reactive to. And that's just one piece. There's lots of threads that are important to raise up. And that's, to me, what's so important about what you also offered is the uniqueness of different people's stories. And there are different ways people go through that. If you're not familiar with Ariel Lucky's work, he's someone who is Jewish identified, who lives in Berkeley. Do you know Ariel? Yeah. Ariel's work is fantastic, and he's a young guy who does a lot of hip-hop work and one-man shows, and has look at the whiteness and look at where is my personal background. And I uplift him and his father in just what you're talking about. Thank you. Ariel, A-R-I-E-L, Lucky is with an E-Y. And his father is, oh my gosh, Paul Kivel, K-I-V-E-L. He's also a well-known activist and anti-racist.
One last question.
I wonder if you could say a little more about the issue of what we need to be aware of, so that when we who are white are working with non-dominant populations, that we don't do unintentional harm. And I raise that just in my own experience, like working with people from targeted groups. I can't really understand the ways in which they're targeted, so I can't prepare them. So I could be teaching them things coming from my perspective that are actually counterproductive in terms of what they need to know to be part of groups that are targeted.
Yeah, let me answer you in 3 ways. One of them is basic knowledge is to look up as much as you can on microaggressions overall and pay attention to the parts that seem confusing. Because it is. It's actually really challenging. If you look at microaggressions, there are going to be some things, I guarantee you, that you read that and go, wait, why is that a problem? Like, I read that it's a problem, but I really don't understand why it's a problem. Like, I just don't get it. And then seek out the people who are having these conversations that are open to having that conversation with you to figure out why is that a problem, so you can deepen your understanding and untwist and untie it. It's been essential for me. The second thing is I believe in ongoing dialogue spaces for people who are active practitioners, so we can come together and talk with one another and learn from each other. So whatever the particular theological questions that are going on for you, whatever the subject area, are there other people who are in that same area who are also tuning into this conversation? Right? Not like who's my neighbor next door who's of that target identity so they can teach me. Do you know what I mean? But like, where is the practitioner conversation happening? And if not, then work to start one, to get together and to start moving through it. And that, for me, has been a lot about what this work has been about. Whether it's the Witnessing Whiteness to get a handle and create a shared language on a campus with people who are just trying to talk with each other to get better at this. Living in the Tension is actually designed to be, it has questions that are prompted about like, okay, from your theological place, from your faith tradition, how did these issues show up? I'm not the one who's going to tell you what those immediate questions and issues are, because I'm not a theologian. But I do know that having those questions discussed amongst each other with people who have their eye on this is essential, and in an ongoing way. I've been going to AWARE meetings for 15 years. Every month for 15 years. All of it's 100% volunteer. It's not even an organized community, other than we all just keep organizing to show up and extend ourselves and then reach back and pull other people in. And I think more groups like that are needed.
Will you join me in thanking Dr. Tochluk for her presentation?